Hello everyone, welcome back to Hooking A. Today I'm going to be going through how to sew in the ends at the end of crocheting your piece, just to finish off and get rid of these dangly bits that we don't want hanging around at the end of the project. I'm going to be using the swatches from my last video as well, just so you can see how those progress. This one that's made of treble stitches, I've already sewn the ends in on this, so here's the front of that piece and then here's the back. And you can see that those ends have completely disappeared, and I'm going to show you how we do that now. The first tool that I will just quickly go over as well, because we're going to be using that right now, is darning needles. They look exactly the same as your normal sewing needle would, except they have a thicker post and the eye at the top of the needle is a lot larger to obviously accommodate how thick a strand of yarn is, considerably more so than a strand of cotton thread. This one in particular, you can see the eye on here is quite large. As I'm using quite a thin cotton yarn, I am actually going to go just for the thinnest one here, as I don't need a huge needle, and with it being thick it might pull up the stitches a little bit too much and create some bumps in my work, which I don't want it to do. So this is the swatch of double crochet, and you can see I've already done half of it in there, where I've just threaded the strand onto the needle and just gone underneath those stitches there. Now you can just snip it off at this point. As it's been fastened off at the top with a knot, it won't come unravelled, but what you might get is that little bit of yarn might end up sticking out. So what I prefer to do is go a little bit further along and then sew it back on itself, just to make sure it's well hidden. So I'm going to do that now. Because this is quite a short strand, I'm going to just pop the needle into there before I thread it, just to make sure I'm not having to pull this around too much and mess my stitches up. So with these needles being larger than a normal sewing needle, it makes them a little bit easier to thread as well, rather than squinting at a tiny needle and trying to thread it. Although I will say trying to thread it while you're looking through a camera is a little bit tricky. There we go. So you don't need any sort of special sewing skills to do this. It's very, very simple. You're just going in straight lines underneath the stitches that you've already made. So that I'm just going to pull that right through. There we go. And you can see that's completely disappeared behind there. And then to go back in the opposite direction, I'm actually going to pull this tighter than it needs to be. You can see it's puckering up those here, and I'll show you why in a moment. So I'm going to go back in the opposite direction, just lifting the needle between the stitch. So it's just going under those loops, and then it won't actually show through at the front. If I show you, my needle's here, but it's not going through to the stitches on the front. And what I'm actually going to do is go right out of the side with this, so you can see it's in the middle of the stitch. It doesn't matter if you split your strands of yarn here either, if the needle goes in between them. That's actually a little bit tighter, so it will hold it a little bit more securely. It's not a problem if that happens, so don't worry about it. So I'm going to pull this all the way out to the side. Again, I'm just going to pull that a little bit tighter than it needs to be. And then very carefully, I'm using some actual thread snippers here, but you can use a normal pair of scissors. Just make sure you don't cut your actual stitch. So I'm just going to line up the blade behind that strand, snip that off, and then because I pulled it tight, I'm just going to pull it back into shape there. And what that does then, that end bit is just going to get pulled back into the stitch, so you don't end up with any little fluffy bits sticking out from where you cut it off. And if I turn that over to the front now, you can't see where those strands went because they're in between the stitches. And so I'm just going to show you that again from the beginning this time. I haven't started doing it at the bottom here in the very start of the work. So this is the foundation chain part here. I've turned it over to the back because we don't want it showing through on the front. I'm going to thread my needle again. Oh, and I've split the yarn slightly there. Again, doesn't matter. There we go. So I'm going to start just above there, and you can go up a little bit higher if you want to, it's entirely up to you. And I'm just going to be wiggling this needle in between the stitches just to get it hidden behind those so we can't see it from the front. And again, it doesn't matter if you split the yarn, sometimes I even do that on purpose, so I'll just do that here. You can see it's gone right in between those twisted strands that actually make up the yarn. If you do split the yarn, you might find it's a little bit tougher just to get the eye of the needle through there, so you might need to give it a little wiggle like this just to get it to go through. There we go. And pull that right across. And then I'm just going to do what I did on the other one. I'm going to go back in the opposite direction, so you can see the ends here. I'm just going to go through the row above it, all the way across to the end. There we go. And then I'm just going to pull this a little bit tighter than it needs to be. You can see it's kind of pulling the stitches across there. Cut that off. And there we go. And I'll just pull that back into shape. Turn it over. And there we go. And that end has disappeared completely. You can't see it from the front. And we've got the end sewn in. Now, if you want to save yourself a little bit of time, particularly if you are working in different colours, so you're going to be changing those over part way through, you will end up with more than one strand hanging out at the end from your colour changes, or you can do this at the beginning just to save yourself a little bit more time when you get to the end. It's just using the loose strands as an extra little bit across here. We're just going to hide it in these stitches as we're crocheting. So I've got 10 chains here and then 10 trebles, and I'm going to, there we go, I'm just going to chain 2 and turn, and then before I start doing my next stitch, this tail end here, I'm just going to put that just against the stitch there. And then it doesn't have to be snug or tight or anything at this point. I'm going to do my stitch as normal, but you can see now that that strand is caught in the top of the stitch below. I'll work my treble as normal, and then if I just pull this up, you can see it's gone up there, and then it's just tucked behind where I've actually made that stitch. So then you can go along and do that on the next one. So if you don't like sewing the ends in, or you've got a project where you've got tons and tons of them, this is a fantastic way of saving yourself that time at the end, because believe me, if you've just done a massive project in particularly something like stripy blankets, and you've left all those ends and you've finished it, and then you've just got all these little strands that you've got to take care of, it's so irritating, and it's the last thing you want to do. You know, you've done all this hard work, it's pretty much finished, and then you've just got all these tiny little bits to take care of at the end, and it's tedious work then. So this is a brilliant way of saving yourself some time, and saving the monotony of having to sew all those ends in. So I've just done a few more trebles across, and each time I'm just bringing that strand along, and you can see it's now going along with my stitches and moving across to the left each time. So I'm just going to go to the end of the row and keep taking it across. And rather than you sitting and watching me do loads more stitches, what I'm going to do is actually, I'll just finish it there. Hang on. I finish it at this point here. So you can see this has just followed along in the bottom of all my stitches as I've been going. If I turn it over, that strand is just here. You can't see that that's there because it's in between the stitch, so it's well hidden in there. And because when we finish the chain here, it's fastened, it's tight, that's not going to go anywhere. So even if that strand were to come out, it won't unravel because the knot's tightened there. So it's fine for you to just snip this end off And as we were doing when we sewed it in, just going to pull it a little bit tighter, snip that again, and then just straighten it back out again, just so at the end isn't going to be sticking out at all. You've not got a fluffy bit. And there you go, and that's disappeared into the piece that you're doing. And if you've left yourself a very long tail, you could do what I've just done there, just do a few stitches and snip it off, and then actually carry on. You don't have to keep it going for the full row, just because it can be a little bit fiddly just holding it as you're going. So just do a few stitches, snip it off, and then it's out your way and it's done, and you don't need to worry about that bit when you come to the end. So there you go, that's two different ways of hiding those ends for a finished piece. And as I said, I'm just going to very briefly go through a couple of extra things that might come in handy to have in your kit. So as I said before, darning needles, you can get these in different sizes. Usually if you buy them, you can buy them as a set, so you would get a selection of sizes anyway. Some people use plastic ones as well. That's totally fine. They don't need to be massively sharp. These ones are, but it doesn't matter if they're blunt, because we're not trying to pierce anything like you would when you're sewing with thread. We're just going under little gaps that are already there. We're just kind of pushing the existing strands aside rather than trying to pierce through a piece of fabric. Thread snippers, again, you don't have to use actual thread snippers. A small pair of scissors is fine. Just make sure that they're sharp enough that they're going to cut through in one go, otherwise you end up with little bits of fluff everywhere. And having them, something like this, is quite useful just because you can line the blade up carefully behind the stitch before you cut. You have a bit more control with these than you would with normal scissors, just because I can have my fingers very close to the blade on this and go slowly. But nail scissors are great as an alternative, but honestly any scissors will do. It's totally fine. A tape measure, obviously you know what a tape measure looks like, but I've just got mine here. These are really nifty when you're trying to work to set sizes, so you can just keep measuring as you go. What you can also do is, if you're using a yarn that you've not used before, making swatches like these actually give you an idea of how many stitches you're actually going to use to make a certain size. So if I knew that I wanted this to be, so you can see this is exactly 3 inches across, and it is just shy of 4 inches vertically. So that gives me an idea of how many stitches I'm going to need if, say, I wanted to make this 8 inches tall. I already know that I've done 15 rows, so I'm going to need to do about 30 rows. It gives you more of an idea of how much you're going to need to do and at what point you'll need to stop. And finally, stitch markers. These are a godsend, especially when you're first starting out. And these are just to help you keep count of your stitches, and also if you're working a slightly more intricate pattern, they can help you know where you've got to do extra things like increasing or decreasing stitches, or if you need to go back into it at some point. Get a few different kinds. Obviously there's all these different coloured ones. These work in the same way as a safety pin, so all you need to do is just pop it through that stitch in the same place that your crochet hook would go, just underneath there, and then you can close it, and you can take that out again and move it quite easily. And you also get this style, which is just an open loop. So the same thing again, you're just going to pop it underneath there, and this one spins all the way around. You might see them marketed as knitting stitch markers, but they're exactly the same thing. And then I also have a few pretty stitch markers. These are ones that I like to use just because they're cute. They look a bit different. So you can see a lot of these have clasps on, similar to what you'd find in necklaces, in jewellery. And then I've also got some that are made out of jewellery wire with just a nice little bead on there. And those work the same as the open loop ones, where you just push this underneath. There we go, spin that round, and that's held nicely in there. And then obviously your ones with the jewellery clasp, you can clip on like that. And obviously you can move these around as and where you need them. You can even make your own. You don't have to use these. If you're really stuck for something to use as a stitch marker, just another piece of thread that you've got, another piece of yarn hanging around, even just string. Just pop your stitch back into one of those hooks, hook that piece through, and there we go. And if you want to, you could just tie that in a loose knot so that it's easy to get out when you've finished with it. So the best thing with stitch markers, the thing that I tend to use them for the most is if I'm doing a project where I've got a very long chain to begin with. You know, it's easy enough to count as you're going, as you're chaining along, but it's not uncommon to lose count, especially if somebody distracts you, or you just kind of, it's a bit of a repetitive motion and you just kind of lose track. What you don't want to have to do is then go right back to the beginning and count from the start all those chains. So something like this, I'd maybe put one about every 20, 25, just so if I do need to go back because I've lost count, I've not got to start right from the beginning again. And that's quite handy. Obviously I've accumulated a lot of these. This pouch is just full of those plastic ones. These are really common as freebies from magazines, or you can pick them up very cheap on Amazon, eBay. Any good haberdashery shop is going to have them, and you can use just other coloured thread if you prefer not to buy these. I've just pulled another darning needle out of here as well. It's supposed to look like this. This one's bent, just to make it a little bit easier for you to get the needle underneath those stitches. If you struggle to grip onto the needle when it's flat, something like this is a little bit more helpful, just because it's easier to grab. So there we go, that's how to sew your ends in, and a few extra tools that might come in handy to have in your crochet kit. In the next video, we're going to look at working in the round. Very similar to working flat. We're just going to have a slightly different way of starting off. So watch this space for the next one, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.